Global trade looks borderless. Cargo crosses oceans. Capital crosses continents. Markets open in Tokyo, close in New York, and reopen in London before most people wake up. It feels seamless. It isn't. In moments of tension, choke points become chokers, not just places on maps, but levers of capital, supply, and power. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil passes through a stretch of water barely 21 miles wide. A single canal in Egypt carries more than 10% of global trade. One grounded container ship in 2021 blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days and froze almost $10 billion a day in commercial activity. The global financial system runs on spreadsheets and satellites, but it squeezes through narrow corridors of land and sea. And when those corridors tighten, money tightens with them. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. This is the story of why strategic choke points have always shaped global finance. Not just wars, not just empires, but inflation, currency dominance, sovereign debt, and global crises. Because when geography narrows, leverage concentrates, and leverage, under pressure, becomes power. The illusion of globalization is that everything is connected evenly. In reality, trade flows through arteries, and arteries can be blocked. This pattern is ancient. In the 5th century BCE, the Hellespont, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, became a strategic obsession for the Persian Empire. Xerxes famously constructed pontoon bridges across it during his campaign against Greece in 480 BCE. Control of that strait meant control of grain shipments from the Black Sea region, a lifeline for Athens. This wasn't just military maneuvering, it was economic survival. Athens depended on imported grain. Disrupt that flow and you destabilize food prices. Destabilize food prices, you destabilize the state. Geography created leverage. Leverage created conflict. Conflict reshaped power. Fast forward 2,000 years. In 1869, the Suez Canal opened under French and Egyptian initiative. It cut the maritime route between Europe and Asia dramatically, eliminating the need to sail around the Cape of Good Hope. What had been a months-long voyage became weeks shorter. Costs fell, trade accelerated, but canals don't just reduce distance, they concentrate power. The British Empire quickly understood what Suez meant. India was the crown jewel of the empire, and Suez was the shortest route to it. In 1875, when Egypt's ruler Ismail Pasha fell into financial distress due to mounting debt from modernization projects, Britain purchased a controlling stake in the canal company. It wasn't philanthropy, it was strategy. Control of Suez secured British access to Asian trade and reinforced London's position as the center of global finance. When capital flows from colonies and trade routes funnel through your shipping lane, your currency benefits. Your banks benefit, your insurers benefit. Sterling dominance was not abstract, it was maritime. By the late 19th century, London was the world's financial clearinghouse. Trade bills were settled in sterling. Insurance contracts were written in sterling. Sovereign debts were issued in sterling. But then came the mid-20th century. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, challenging British and French control. Britain, France, and Israel launched a military intervention. The United States, fearing Soviet escalation and financial instability, pressured Britain to withdraw. The crisis exposed something deeper than a diplomatic dispute. Britain was no longer the undisputed financial hegemon. Its foreign reserves were limited. The pound came under pressure. The U.S. refused to back sterling unconditionally. Within weeks, Britain was forced to retreat, militarily and financially. Suez marked a symbolic turning point in British imperial decline. Geography shifted. Power shifted. Finance followed. When Britain lost secure leverage over Suez, its ability to project financial dominance weakened. The dollar's rise accelerated. Control the canal, influence the currency. But canals are only one form of choke point. Energy is another. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran and Oman, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. Roughly 20% of global oil consumption passes through it daily. That's not a statistic. That's a pressure point. In 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, OPEC imposed an oil embargo against the United States and other Western nations. Oil prices quadrupled within months. Energy-dependent economies experienced inflation spikes and economic contraction simultaneously. Stagflation, high inflation, and high unemployment shattered post-war economic assumptions. This wasn't caused by reckless money printing alone. It began with supply restriction in a geographically constrained region. When oil supply tightens at a choke point, energy prices surge. Energy feeds into transportation, manufacturing, heating, food production. Inflation spreads, central banks respond, interest rates rise, debt servicing costs increase, sovereign budgets strain, currency valuations shift. In the late 1970s, the Iranian Revolution triggered another oil shock. Production fell. Prices spiked again. Inflation reaccelerated in the United States and Europe. Paul Volcker, then chairman of the Federal Reserve, responded by raising interest rates aggressively in 1979 and 1980. The federal funds rate climbed above 19% at its peak. The result was a deep recession, but inflation was eventually contained. This is the chain reaction: choke point disruption, commodity spike, inflation surge, monetary tightening, debt stress. Sometimes inflation doesn't start in the printing press. It starts in a narrow stretch of water, and it doesn't stop there. The Strait of Malacca, between Malaysia and Indonesia, handles roughly a quarter to a third of global trade and the majority of energy imports to China, Japan, and South Korea. It is one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes in the world. If Malacca were blocked, energy-hungry Asian economies would face immediate shortages. Shipping costs would rise, insurance premiums would jump, markets would reprice risk within hours. Global finance reacts to physical constraint. The Taiwan Strait presents another modern vulnerability. Taiwan produces more than 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductor chips through companies like TSMC. These chips power smartphones, data centers, military equipment, and financial infrastructure. In 2021 and 2022, pandemic disruptions and supply chain bottlenecks led to chip shortages that affected automotive production, consumer electronics, and industrial equipment globally. Prices rose, production schedules slipped. Imagine that disruption magnified by geopolitical conflict. Block Taiwan's semiconductor exports, and you don't just disrupt technology. You disrupt the digital backbone of the global financial system. Markets are digital. Trade is physical. The two are inseparable. Even climate can create choke points. In 2023 and 2024, drought conditions reduced water levels in the Panama Canal, limiting the number of ships that could transit daily. Shipping delays increased, freight costs rose, supply chains adjusted. A canal built in 1914, itself a strategic masterpiece of American engineering and power projection, became vulnerable to rainfall patterns. Globalization is not frictionless, it is conditional. What ties all these examples together is not coincidence, it is compression. When global trade compresses through narrow corridors, leverage emerges, and leverage influences finance. Insurance premiums increase when routes are threatened. Commodity prices adjust to perceived risk. Bond yields shift if inflation expectations rise. Currency values move when trade balances fluctuate. Financial markets are not detached from geography. They are hypersensitive to it. The more integrated the global economy becomes, the more critical choke points become. Because integration increases dependency. Dependency creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates pricing power. And pricing power translates into influence over inflation, monetary policy, and capital flows. The 2021 Suez blockage caused by the container ship Ever Given offered a modern reminder. A single vessel ran aground in the canal for 6 days. Hundreds of ships were delayed. Oil prices ticked upward. Supply chains were disrupted. Markets reacted. 6 days. Now imagine sustained closure due to conflict. In late February 2026, joint U.S. and Israeli strikes targeted Iran's leadership. The supreme leader was killed. Retaliation followed. Missile exchanges, regional escalation, military posturing across the Gulf, and immediately markets moved. Not because of ideology, not because of headlines, because of the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 1/5 of global oil consumption flows through that narrow passage. Tanker traffic slowed. Insurance premiums for shipping spiked. Energy futures surged on fears of supply disruption. This is not speculation, it is structure. When a choke point destabilizes, oil markets tighten. When oil markets tighten, inflation expectations adjust. When inflation expectations rise, bond yields move. When bond yields move, equity valuations reprice. When valuations reprice, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and household portfolios feel it. A missile launch in the Gulf can ripple into your mortgage rate. Global finance does not respond to abstract danger. It responds to bottlenecks. We saw this pattern in the 1970s. We saw it during the Suez Crisis. We saw it during pandemic-era supply chain disruptions. And we are watching it unfold again. Consider the broader backdrop. The global economy today is heavily indebted. Sovereign debt levels in advanced economies remain historically high. Corporate leverage is elevated. Households are exposed to mortgage and consumer credit obligations. Central banks are navigating post-pandemic inflation pressures and fragile growth. In such an environment, supply shocks matter more. When debt is high, inflation is destabilizing. When inflation is destabilizing, monetary tightening becomes politically painful. When monetary tightening becomes painful, financial stress follows. Strategic choke points amplify that fragility. If oil flows are disrupted for weeks, energy importing nations face trade deficits. Currencies weaken. Governments subsidize fuel costs to prevent unrest. Fiscal balances deteriorate. Investors demand higher yields to compensate for risk. It doesn't take a full blockade. It takes uncertainty. Financial markets price probability, insurance companies price exposure, central banks price expectations. The more fragile the system, the more sensitive it becomes to geography. Now widen the lens. The Strait of Hormuz is not the only pressure point. The Red Sea shipping lanes have faced disruptions from regional conflict. The Panama Canal's capacity has been constrained by drought. The Taiwan Strait remains a geopolitical flashpoint tied directly to semiconductor supply chains. These are not isolated events. They are nodes in a network. Globalization has concentrated efficiency. It has not eliminated risk. When trade routes were longer and more diversified, shocks were slower. Today, supply chains are optimized. Just-in-time logistics reduce storage costs. Efficiency is high, but redundancy is low. The modern financial system assumes continuity of flow. When that continuity is threatened, volatility increases. Look at freight rates during major disruptions. During the pandemic, container shipping costs from Asia to Europe surged several-fold. Commodity prices followed. Consumer prices rose. Inflation reached levels not seen in decades in some advanced economies. Central banks tightened policy aggressively. Asset prices adjusted. Housing markets cooled. That chain reaction began with physical disruption. Strategic choke points do not create inflation alone, but they can trigger it. They do not cause currency collapse by themselves, but they can accelerate capital flight. They do not guarantee recession, but they increase the probability of monetary miscalculation. And miscalculation is expensive. If there were a gold medal for assuming stability in an unstable world, policymakers would still be on the podium. But markets are less sentimental. They adjust quickly. When risk premiums rise in shipping lanes, they feed into trade finance costs. When trade finance costs rise, margins shrink. When margins shrink, earnings forecasts adjust. When earnings forecasts adjust, stock prices move. Behind every headline about geopolitical tension is a spreadsheet recalculating exposure. This is why strategic choke points matter beyond military analysis. They influence inflation trajectories. They affect interest rate policy. They shape sovereign credit ratings. They alter currency flows. And they remind us that global finance rests on physical infrastructure. For investors and citizens seeking financial freedom, this is not abstract theory. It is risk awareness. You cannot predict every crisis, but you can understand the structure of vulnerability. Ask simple questions. Where does essential trade concentrate? How dependent is your economy on imported energy or critical components? How exposed is your currency to commodity price swings? How leveraged is the financial system when shocks hit? History shows that choke points do not disappear. They shift. The Hellespont mattered to Athens. Suez mattered to Britain. Hormuz matters to the modern energy market. Malacca matters to Asian industrial economies. Taiwan matters to digital infrastructure. Control over these arteries confers leverage. Leverage influences negotiation power. Negotiation power shapes financial outcomes. Global markets look digital, but the system still runs through narrow corridors of land and sea. When those corridors tighten, money follows. Strategic choke points have always shaped global finance because they compress trade into controllable space. Control over space translates into influence over supply. Influence over supply affects prices. Prices shape inflation. Inflation drives monetary policy. Monetary policy determines credit conditions, and credit conditions determine who thrives and who struggles. Geography does not care about ideology. It does not respect central bank independence. It does not negotiate with bond markets. It constrains. History does not repeat, but geography does not change. The next time markets move sharply on news from a distant strait or canal, remember this. Finance is not floating above the world. It is anchored to it. And if you want to protect your wealth in an interconnected age, you must understand not just balance sheets, but bottlenecks.